Okay, share number two. This is going to be different than the first share in that the first share I spent a lot of time talking because I understood the problems. This week I'm nervous about even saying what the narrow texts say because it'll bias us just trying to figure out if it solves a long term problem. I don't think I have. I have certainly. I don't think I have the Rishonim down cold at all. So I'm gonna try and hope, and hopefully you'll help me read it. And it's good. My expectation is it will take us another. It will take this week and next week to finish the Makara set. And this week we'll just set up. We'll set up another aspect of the problem. We'll understand some of the alternatives in Rishonim to Rashi, or at least we'll understand there are alternatives to Rashi. And the idea is that, and then next week we'll do Achronim, and then we'll have time to try and figure out what we think Rashi means at the end of all that. Okay, so where we were last week is basically we're in the middle of right. We're reading all the Rashis on the sugya. We don't, at least I don't really understand what all the Rashis are doing. So I'm going to just bring up all the Rashis on the sugya to start with, so we can recreate the problems, and then we're going to go to Chulin. We're going to see how Rashi read Chulin. We're going to understand. Right, we're not going to, since Chulin is a tangent, so I'm not going to try and really understand how Rashi read the whole sugya. I just want to understand how Rashi read the quotes of Temurah in the context of that sugya. And then we'll go look at another sugya that has influenced many other Rishonim's interpretation, and we'll see that Rashi explicitly tries to integrate the sugyot there. And then we'll go to see how other Rishonim did it and their critiques of Rashi. And from their critiques of Rashi, we can try to figure out how they understood Rashi. And then we can try and figure out whether we agree with their understanding of Rashi and whether it makes sense. And obviously, it's always a problem to learn something from someone else's critique because they thought it was unsatisfactory. So you have to figure out right, whether the reason they thought it was unsatisfactory was because they misunderstood him or because they just had a fundamental disagreement. Okay, so here we are in the glad you finally made it in right, Bill. So here we are in the. Here's just a presentation of all the Rashis in the sugya, so we can recall for ourselves what all the problems were. I need to get one more page. Here we are. Okay, so on the sugya, Rashi says, first of all, the Mishnah says, I call me Mirin, and Rashi says, Behemoth Chulin Zu Tachasu Shalektesh. We didn't really understand what Rashi's adding there. It sounds like a definition of Chulin. He uses the language of Tachazu, but he doesn't quote the later Mishnah, which tells you what language you need to use. And it seemed to me that he doesn't sufficiently disambiguate if the issue is whether we're talking about is the we're talking about is whether the hakol is everybody or everything. It's not clear to me how this would disambiguate. So I don't know what this Rashi does at all. Okay, then he says lo shadam rashai l'hamir daksiv lo yamir. So it seems important to convey to us that the reason that we know it's not true is because there's a pasuk. I don't know why. But vim hamir mumar. Why the matfis alei kedusha ushtehen kedushos? Yeah. What else does mumar mean? Again, it seems definitional. So I don't know what he's adding. That seems redundant, especially in light of the previous Rashi, which said that lo shadam rashai lamir daksiv lo yamir. So why quote the pasuk twice? And that's the end of the Rashi's on the Mishnah. We get to the Gemara. Rashi says lo shadam rashai diavad. Right. So our Gemara, that's the hakol is a chatchila, lo shadam rashai is diavad. So Rashi says bitmiya. So right, we're saying right, this is an incredulity. It's not that there are two cases, one of which is l'chachila, one of which is b'diavad. It's that we're reading them in contradiction. Okay, we'll see today that a plausible reading of the sugya would be that when we say hakol l'chachila lo shadam rashai b'diavad, all we're doing is actually dividing the Mishnah into two cases as opposed to a contradiction. Rashi tells you read the sugya as a contradiction, and then Rashi says l'chachila in rashai l'hamir aval diavad shapir damin. So Rashi sees here, it seems that his purpose is to tell us that the Evid doesn't mean that it works b'diavad, but that it's okay b'diavad. That's a very strange reading, but it's hard to say a shiapir, right? Should say with the Evid nitpas or something like that. So trying to figure out like why Rashi would do that if in fact that is the correct reading of Rashi. Vilo Yamir. So at the end, the Gemara says, right in our Gemara, right, it's adikashulach masnisin and kashulach kroi, right? The Chsiv Lo Yamir. Rashi says the masnisin katane da kol Yamir and afilu lechatchila. So the problem is the pasuk is a kasha on the b'diavad position, not just on the chatchila position. So why does Rashi go out of his way to tell you that the kasha is on the hakol as opposed to it should be a kasha on even the diavad? Let's just say diavad means maybe right means possibly diavad. Very very strange, right? But since Rashi went out of his way to say that diavad is shaper dummy, so I don't understand what that Rashi is doing either. Hachi Garcinan. Ella Hachi Katani, right? So we pointed out that the Ella is not in the Vilna edition, and the Vilna edition has Rav Yehuda Omer, and Rashi doesn't have that. So both of those are possibilities as to what Rashi changed, either putting in the Ella, taking out the Rav Yehuda, or both. Hakol matfisin b'tmura echad v'chule. So it sounds like it's not about the echad nashim v'echad anashim v'echad nashim based on the v'chule, but then Rashi puts in the echad nashim v'echad nashim. Kilomar shetofeses kedushas tmura b'vehema bein al pin anashim bein al pin nashim. So if the al pin nashim pin anashim was irrelevant in the the Hachi Katani, why does Rashi feel compelled to put it in the paraphrase? Really strange. Right, we could conceivably repunctuate it and say that it's really Rashi's common ends that Shetashusha Turvahema, and then Beit al Pianashim is really a requote of the Mishnah, but he has echad, so it's hard. Okay, and then Rashi, having apparently requoted the Mishnah in paraphrase, then the text of Rashi becomes a mess. Umashma, dimashma, afilu, kilomar, nami, like the whole thing, like what this whole line means. And after all those, right, which I had to figure out, is it afilu, is it nami, is it kilomar, is it kimo, kigon? Right, we looked at all those texts. They're not in this version, but we looked at all those texts. The Rashi is kimo d'im hemira afilu isha to feset al pia kedushas tmura velosha adam rashai. So really strange. All right. So Rashi is now right. So the first part of Rashi, again, that gets rid of the Rashi's kilomar means that we're already in the first line. We're already saying something diavad. What are we saying about the diavad? So why does Rashi have to say afilu isha? What does that have to do with anything? What's the right? It sounds like Rashi thinks that it's only after the paraphrase that you say this. The paraphrase creates significance for al pianashim ben al pinashim, but I don't know what that is. Okay, so that's basically the outcome. Is I can't read a single line of Rashi and understand why he's saying it. Well, I have no difficulty translating the words that are that are in the text. I don't know what the words of the text are, and I don't know how much the various emendations change things. So that's our problem. With that problem, what we're going to do this week is just look at a bunch of Gemaras, and then if we have time, we'll start looking at a bunch of Rishonim. Specifically, we'll try to see what we can say about the position of Rabbeinu Tam, and whether there is a consistent position of the Beit Medrash Shel Ramban. And we'll try and understand how they read the Gemara, how they read Rashi, and then try and plug all that back into our Rashi. Okay, here's the sugya in Chulin. Okay, the sugya in Chulin, you're all used to by now. That what I want to do is I want to look at it structurally before I look at it substantively. Right, what goes on? What is this sugya doing? And then after we look at what the sugya is doing, then we can figure out what's our purposes. So we looked at last time that the sugya is structured, and again, as Chatayim Eskirayom, the first time I taught this, I did not realize this, that the sugya in Chulin is structured around two appearances of the phrase Hakol Shochtin in the first parak of Chulin. Right, so the sugya in parak Aleph never mentions the second one. That's why I didn't realize it. But actually, everything is shadowed by the existence of their two Hakol Shochtins. Okay, so the Gemara begins by saying Hakol Shochtin l'chatchila u'shkutas sankshera diavad, and I have punctuated it bitmia. But you'll see that there's a way of reading the sugya where maybe or maybe not, right? Maybe that is not necessary. Maybe it's not a stira. Maybe it's a statement. Okay, Amar Rav Acha Breder Rav Ravashi v'chol hakol lechatchilahu. Okay, so Rav Acha Breder Rav says Ravashi, I don't know why you are reading it that way. Why don't you just read it that both of them are b'diavad? That seems to be his approach. Okay, the Gemara then goes on a long excursus, which I'm not going to take a strong academic position, but Balabatish, right? There's Amar Le Ravacha Ravashi. There's another Amar Le down here. You can skip everything in between, and everything makes sense. So a reasonable Balabatish supposition is that everything in between is an interjection of the stam, and the live dialogue goes down the right hand margin. Okay, so let's so the at this point, right, Ravacha Bred Rava says to Ravashi, the premise of your reading, maybe the premise of your stira, is that whenever it says Hakol, it's l'chatchila. That's not true. Why is it not true? Because we know that Hakol Memirin can't be l'chatchila because there's a pasuk. Right, right. That seems to be the that's right. That could be the continuation of Ravacha B'Ravina. That could be the end of it. But however you want, right? But that's the way It could be the Ravacha B'Ravina as an example, but in the Gemara, right? Is every Hakol l'chatchila. I can prove to you that not every Hakol l'chatchila is l'chatchila because everyone knows that Temurah uses the same grammatical the same literary formula, Hakol exin, and it's not l'chatchila. Okay, at the end of the excursus of the Gemara says, you know what? Ika kol l'chatchila, v'ika kol b'diavad. Some hakols are l'chatchila, and some hakols are b'diavad. So really, what Rav Acha B'Rei Ravina asked Rav Ashi was, why are you reading this hakol l'chatchila? And right, and the Gemara clearly reads it as a contradiction, right? Because the Gemara says the tikshilach, right? Ela kol dehacha mimayd l'chatchila hu the tikshilach, dilma b'diavad hu the lo tikshilach. Okay, so the Gemara sets it up that the initial premise of Hakol Shochatin Lichatchila, which the Gemara claims is the way that Rav Ashi read it, although Rav Ashi hasn't appeared as a character before Amalei Rav Acha B'Rei Rav Ashi, but Rav Acha B'Rei Ravina assumes that Rav Ashi read it this way, right? Obviously, if you're a good traditionalist, you'll take that as evidence that Rav Ashi is the stam, whatever you want. And he says, why are you reading it in such a way that this is l'chatchila? Okay. 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 Thank you. I'm just reading Will's comments. Okay. You can read the comments also about what Professor Levy thought. Okay. So that right. So the bracketed section ends up concluding that hakols can be either way, and that that hakol memirin is an example where it can't. Well, hakol memirin is, but in the end, that kasha is disposed of. Right? How the kasha of hakol memirin is disposed of, it doesn't matter to us. But we have a right. But we end up being comfortable saying that hakol can be either. Okay. The question is, how does that tie into the Havamina and Maskana of our Gemara? Do you think Hakol can be right? Is our Gemara compatible at the outset with the belief that Hakol can be either l'chatchila or b'diavad, and is our Gemara compatible after the paraphrase with the conclusion that Hakol can be either l'chatchila or b'diavad? Right? How does Rashi understand that? But the challenge here is really there are This sugya has the sugya in Chulin has two different Havaminas and Maskanas. It has Havamina and Maskana within this tangent. It is not right that its Havamina is that Hakol Memirin is l'chatchila, and then it responds to that Havamina, and it responds to that Havamina in one of two ways. One response is no, that Hakol that Hakol is not l'chatchila, but it doesn't prove anything. Because really all Hakols are l'chatchila except for that one. Right, that's one. That's one possibility. Or the other possibility is no, that Hakol is l'chatchila, but it has a grammatical structure that makes it irrelevant to all Hakols. Right, so we don't know. All we know in the end is that there's a way to make Temurah unique. Okay, we'll have to talk about exactly how that structure is. Then at the end of the sugya, so the Gemara is Hakol l'chatchila. So he says to him, "Anash chitasam kshera kashali." You're asking me. You Rav Acha B'Rei Rava assumed that the reason I was troubled by this Mishnah in Chulin was because of a contradiction, right? And I thought hakol is lechatchila shchitasang shera is b'diavad as a contradiction. No, you're wrong entirely. Anash shchitasang shera kashali. What does that mean? Midekatani shchitasang shera diavad, because since it says shchitasang shera is diavad, michlal hakol lechatchilahu diavad tarti diavad lamalu. So that's a really right. That's like as radical a difference between Havamim and Askana in terms of literary reading as you can get. So, right, so Rav Acha thought that Rav Ashi was asking a contradiction, and that's why he said Akol Shochtin L'Chatchila. But actually, he wasn't asking a contradiction at all. What he was saying is, I know that Akol has to be L'Chatchila because otherwise it would be redundant. If I thought Akol was B'diavad, it would make it worse, not better. So since I don't want the redundancy, now I'm left with L'Chatchila, with one L'Chatchila and one B'diavad, and now that could be a stira. Or it doesn't have to be a stira. It could also be just a revelation that we're talking about two different cases. We'll have to see which way we read it. But he says kashali. So Pashtus is what he's saying is that you thought I had a contradiction, and actually it wasn't the language of a kol that drove me to it. It's just that I know that a kol can't be b'diavad, so that's redundant. So it must be l'chatchila. Now what do I do? Okay, a little bit odd. In that context, of Rav Ashi's answer, Rashi integrates specifically the sugya of Temurah, even though the Gemara doesn't. Hey, Rashi says, hang on a sec, if you read this doesn't seem to make sense with that sugya in Temurah. So I have to figure out how Rashi integrates it, and do we assume that Rashi is consistent across the two Gemaras? Okay, then I pointed out that in the end, so this sugya ends by resolving that whether you think that was Rav Ashi's idea or not, but this sugya in the first stuff ends with Rabbi Bar Ula and then a bunch of other people, all of whom say no. Actually, there are two cases. One of them is l'chatchila, and one of them is b'diavad. Hakol shochatin is a case that is l'chatchila, and shchitasang shera is a case that is b'diavad, and they all go through They all go through the various ways of constructing which case is kosher b'diavad but not l'chatchila. Okay, that's what all the Amoraim do at the beginning. The question is, okay, what do you do with the second hakol shochatin? So the Gemara in Chulin Daf Tezayin has two possibilities. The second possibility, the last possibility, is Ela Amar Rava, which says, yeah, that too, right? That's right. That too comes to introduce another case, which is l'chatchila. Right, so we really have to say Hakol Shochatin, which tells us that the baseline is l'chatchila. Then there's an extra Hakol Shochatin to teach us that there's a case of l'chatchila that we wouldn't have thought was, and there's an extra Chitasing Sheret to tell us that the case is b'diavad that we wouldn't have thought it was. There's no linguistic evidence in any of those cases, so you can figure out what you will about that mode of using riboy miut as a way of reading Mishnah. The first answer the Gemara gives there, though, is that the second Hakol Shochatin doesn't mean everybody shechts, it means that everything is shechted. Right, and that's what I point out. So that means that the grammatical form Hakol Shochatin can either refer to the shechters or the shechted, and by the same token, that means that it's plausible to read Hakol Memirin as either the shechter or the shechted in either the Havamina or the Maskana. So you have to figure out how to integrate that as well. Okay, those are the structural elements that there are. Right, the Gemara itself has a Havamina about Temurah, which it then rejects. The Gemara has a Havamina about Hakol, which it then at least offers an alternative for. And in that thing, Rashi goes back and explains Temurah again. Now let's see how Rashi does how Rashi handles both of these. Okay, so Hakol Shochatin l'chatchila v'shchitasan shera diavad. Amar le Rav Acha b'rei Rav Rav Ashi v'chi hakol l'chatchilahu ela me'ata hakol memirin echad hanashim ve'echad hanashim hachinami l'chatchilahu v'aksiv li'achlifenav li'amirato tov b'rabbatov. Okay, so this should be parallel to the question in our sugya kashilach kra, which he answers. He says hasam kidikatani tama. So far as I can tell, I haven't looked at all of them in Shas. Hasabiki Katani Tama, always everywhere else means that we're actually providing a rationale. Now, we talked about the rationale, legal change distinction in terms of Lo Shadam Rashai. The Katani Tama, so far as I can tell, is always a Tam. And I don't see any way to read it here as a Tam, so I'm a little baffled. And there are no manuscripts that I can tell that take out Katani Tama in any way or alter it in any way that's significant. So I think that's just a problem. Lo Shadam Rashai Lamir. So Rashi says, what does that mean? Diksiv lo yachlifenu. So immediately I have the question, hang on a sec. No, right, Rashi on our Mishnah, right, quotes lo yamir, not lo yachlifenu. Okay, so you can decide whether which thing he quotes matters or not. Right, whether there's general consistency about the psukim or not. Elashim heimir mumar nitpestes hashnia ushtei kedushot. Okay, right, that's a definition again that seems very much like Rashi on our Mishnah. So that again just seems to be exactly what he wrote in our Mishnah, except that the psukim are different. Okay, yeah, maybe there's a manuscript of Rashi that changes it. Maybe we should treat that or not. But now Rashi tells us what he thinks the pshat in the relationship with the two pieces of the Mishnah are, in a way he did not in our sugya and Temurah. So he says, the akar l'hakol deresha, the lo tema lechatchilahu. Right. So Rashi says when the line Lo Shadam Rashai Lehemir uproots the Hakol, so that you should not think it's Lechatchila. So Rashi tells you that his understanding of the Maskana in this section of the Gemara in Chulin is that we think Hakol Memirin is B'diavad. Right. In what way? V'reisha Hachi Kamar Hakol Din Temurah Noheget Bahem. So if I'm reading this naively, right, Rashi says the way we do that is by well, it depends again, really. It's whether Hakol Din Temurah Noheget Bahem. Who is the Bahem? Is the Bahem the animals or is the Bahem the people? So really, you have the same ambiguity. It doesn't really resolve anything. All we know is in the end, Rashi somehow thinks this means lichat. Right? This means the b'diavad and not lichatchila. Okay. V'hadetani b'reisha hakol memirin. So when the Mishnah says hakol memirin at the beginning, so if hakol really means lechatchila, and lo shadam rashai clarifies, I said that, but I didn't mean lechatchila. You would be misunderstanding it if you thought it was lechatchila. So Rashi says, why do that? Right. So the fact that the Mishnah there says hakol memirin and then finds it necessary to explain, oh, I didn't mean it was permitted. Why didn't the Mishnah just frame itself in the very beginning, right? Like Hakol Sheshachatu Shkitasang Share, which is a possibility raised in the Sugya and Chulin. Why didn't the Mishnah just say it that way? So Rashi says, Lashun Hatanoim Huze Kimo Hakol Shoktin Hakol Samchin Hakol Chayavit. In essence, it rhymes. Hilcha Chacha. The Hacha here means Temurah, which is a little bit weird. Avagav the Hutzrach La'arich, even though it is compelled to write it in a longer way. Loshina Atana et Lashana. Aval Hakol Shochatin B'duchte Kai. Okay, so the Kol Kamad Lo Akarle, because so long as we have no later line that uproots it, Vitana, and doesn't write Lo Shu Psulam Rashayim Lishchot Gedei Akar Hasam. You don't have a line that's exactly parallel literally to the line in our Mishnah in Temurah. Mashmel Chatchila Rabinu. So then we stick at this point in the Gemara with the belief that Hakol implies the Chatchila, and that generates our problem. Okay, so we get a whole complex of things out of this Rashi. Rashi thinks in this sugya that Lo Shadam Rashai Lamir is a particular literary form that is intended to uproot, which is true literally, right? Lo Shadam Rashai Lamir means, right, I said that, but don't think that. So Rashi thinks that's a form which is necessitated by a desire to make this Mishnah rhyme with the first Mishnah of so many other Masechtot. We wanted to start a Kol Memira and not a Kol She'emiru. So we're forced into this language. Really, ordinarily, Hakol means Lichatchila, but Hakol Emirin doesn't mean Lichatchila. it means b'diavad. We don't know what b'diavad means, except we know it's usher, right? So pashtus, b'diavad means, right? It's really usher, but it is, right? But it works anyway. Okay, now at the end of the sugya, we no longer think that hakol necessarily means lechatchila, which raises the question. So then, does that mean we have to uproot our whole explanation of v'lo shadam rashai, right? Because Rashi solves the redundancy by saying, "Oh, we had to use that language. That language implies lechatchila, so we have to undo it." But if it turns out at the end of the sugya that there are ella in ika kol lechatchila v'ika kol diavad, so then maybe we don't need to disambiguate. Maybe Rashi is bothered by that problem. Maybe he's not. So our intellectual task is to say, okay, I'm just on bare surfaces, right? Do we think that this explanation of the relationship between the first and the second line, that there's no lechatchila in our mission at all, is all b'diavad. There's no information, there's no extra information contained in the second line. The only information the second line adds is to re-explain the first. It's interesting that Rashi says a called din t'murah no heget b'hem when he's explaining V'reisha hachi kamar, so he has the opportunity to introduce the paraphrase of the Gemara, and he doesn't. He doesn't say hakol matfisin b't'murah kamar. Now, why doesn't he do that? So the easy reason for that is because he thought hakol matfisin b't'murah is utterly ambiguous, which is why he had to throw in all the kolomars in our sugya. Right, but then why didn't he just explain the kol matfisin b't'murah as hakol din t'murah no heget b'hem? Right, that's not the language he uses in Tamur either. If we go back to Rashi goes all over the place, right? I call it right. Kimod imhemira filu isha to fez, right? Where's all that coming from? So it's not clear to me how the how the Rashi and the Sugi integrates. It is clear to me. I think that how Rashi reads the Havamina and Maskana in this section of the Gemara and Chulin is clear. Okay, now let's see how Rashi reads the end of the sugya. Okay, so we say, "In ika kol lechatchila, ika kol diavad, ela kol dahacha, mimay lechatchilahu, the tikshilach, dilma diavad v'lo tikshilach." So Rashi responds, "Anash chitas sankshera kashali, midikatanish chitas sankshera diavad, nichlal dahakol lechatchilahu, the diavad tarti diavad lamali." Okay, so here's Rashi's explanation of that. Hachi ibayil limisnei. It should have said. Shchita sakol kshera chutz michereshot v'katan. The mashmir shapir dehana the rabbinan mehakol the eved kam rabbinan v'lo lechatchila. Okay, so Rashi thinks that if we had phrased it as shchita sakol kshera, right, descriptively, as opposed to akol shochatin, which he treats as something like a normative statement, a prescriptive statement. Not clear that Meshchitas Akshol Kshera really works the same thing, but let's assume there is a language. Maybe that's the right language, right? And it preserves the word Hakol. That's right. As Rashi thinks it matters whether you put the word Hakol at the beginning and you have right. However it is, Rashi thinks there's a language. There's a language b'diavad. It should have used a language other than Hakol Exin, which implies the Chatchila. It didn't. Okay, right? Since it didn't, therefore, I think Hakol means the Chatchila. Then Rashi says. Inami, and I'm not at all sure that I am correctly parsing the Rashi at this stage. So Inami, alternatively, what the Mishnah could have said to avoid the implication of the Chachila is Nisne Akol Shochatin Lichudei Kedetnan Gabi Marichin V'Nodrin V'Lo Mefarish Lama Lemisne Akol Shochatin V'Tzarech Lefrushi Ketasang Shera. So what is Rashi doing here? He says, my problem is shchita kshera is the word shchita kshera. Because the word shchita kshera is the diavad, which implies the first one must be the chatchila, otherwise they're two diavad. So he says, okay, so my problem number one is why do we have this double language? Why don't we just put it into one phrase and make it all b'diavad? Or alternatively, I don't really understand the alternative. Inami nisni hakol shochetin lechute. Keditnan gabi marichin v'nodrin. Don't have your second line. V'lo mefaresh lama lo misni hakol shochetin. Lo mefaresh lama lo misni hakol shochetin. V'istarach lefrushesh k'tasing shera l'meimer de shochetin deresha di'evitu. So I don't understand how the inami, what the inami is. Does anybody have ideas? Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that, right? And then, right, that'll be something that we can all come up with by next week to figure out like how the inami. I think I'm just reading something wrong. So how to do it, but we'll go. There's enough to do this week that we can go ahead and we can try and revisit that next week. Okay, ikasha. So now Rashi says, now is the ikasha on one or both of the prior things, assuming that the inami actually introduces an alternative there? I don't know. The ikasha bitmura nami hatani v'hadar mefarish. Hang on a sec. You'll tell me. You are telling me that you have an explanation, right? You are telling me, you Rav Ashi, are telling me that you have an explanation or you have a problem with the sugya in Chulin. The sugya in Chulin is unusual. The mission in Chulin is unusual because it has both the language of Chila and B'diavad, and you think that you can't just reconcile that by saying that the B'diavad, that the second line explains the first. You're gonna tell me, hang on a sec. Hang on a sec. Isn't this just like Temurah? So if you don't have a problem in Temurah, why do you have a problem here? Now that's not so good because in the tangent, right, we already explained what's different about Temurah. Temurah is a language of Losh Adam Rashai. It's a Tama. So I don't know how this question squares with the tangent. So if you have a problem, Rashi says, with the way that I just explained Rav Ashi, because the way I just explained Rav Ashi, the Mishnah in Chulin is supposed to be unique, and it's not unique because it's just like Temurah, and yet we're going to explain the Mishnah in Chulin differently than we explain the Mishnah in Temurah. Don't be. No, it's really not the same way. Not the same, because they're not framed the same way. Okay, and then he says, "V'imishum lo shadam rashai." So maybe right, Rashi's figuring out how to reconcile it. If you're going to say no, it doesn't use that. There's no language of b'di evet there in the same way that there is of a kol shochas and shchutasang shera. What there is this line, "V'imishum lo shadam rashai." So there, mishum deboy la suke v'sofek et arbaim to ashmeinan delokin alav she'ein bo masa. The purpose of the line Lo Shadam Rashai is to teach you about Malchus. Because it's telling you that, right, you get Malchus and Lav She'ein Bo Masa. So the first thing in that, which is not Arishu yet, is that obviously there's going to be a machloket in the Gemara about whether our Mishnah does or does not hold Lokin and Lav She'ein Bo Masa. There's a position that says you're Lokin and Lav She'ein Bo Masa, and there's a position that says that Temurah has a Masa, which is speech, and so we're taking. Right, so Rashi's explanation commits the Gemara here to one side of that issue. We're going to bracket that for now. Rashi says the whole purpose of the line Lo Shadam Rashai is unrelated to teaching us that it's B'diavad. It's there to teach us. Well, that line is just there to teach us Sofeg et Arba'im. So you shouldn't have Rav Ashi's problem here. Why are there two B'diavads? No, there aren't, right? Because really there's a line which just teaches you B'diavad, and then there's a line which teaches you that this B'diavad is Chayav Malchus. Now, is that compatible with what he said above? Kidikatani Tama? Is that compatible with our sugya in Temurah? None of this comes up. Rashi didn't bring any of this up. Right? Because the next line of the Gemara is what brings up Lav Shem Maseh. Maybe. Okay, so that's where I am in this sugya. I think Rashi in Chulin goes out of his way to explain how to make the Mishnah in Chulin compatible, the Mishnah in Temurah compatible with the Sugya in Chulin. Rashi in Temurah does not go out of his way to explain how to make the Sugya in Temurah compatible with the Mishnah in Chulin. But to say that Rashi is atomistic, he doesn't care, I don't understand. Now you can tell me, oh no, Chulin is different. The reason Rashi has to explain it is because we already quoted the Mishnah in Temurah in the Sugya, and therefore Rashi has to answer all questions about the Mishnah in Temurah in the context of Chulin. He's not integrating sugyos. He's just dealing with a kasha from a text that's already in the sugya. Okay, that's I think that's a plausible hypothesis, albeit one I don't believe.
Can you say why you don't believe it? That seems the most obvious answer.
Yeah, it does seem the most obvious answer, but I get, it's probably just chush based on other Rashis. It doesn't seem to me that's what drives it, and it seems like it's so unnecessary. It's so unnecessary. It's like not a kasha that would have bothered anybody else at that point. So it doesn't convince me, but I have to say it because it could be true. But I just don't have it. I suspect that when we look at all the evidence, it won't work. I'm also interested in Rashi's line, the Hatani v'hadar mefarish, which sounds like v'hadar Tani in our sugya in Temurah. But of course, v'hadar Tani only exists in some girsaos of our sugya in Temurah. So so how that integrates as well. So I think you can construct the you can make an attempt to make all of this Rashi consistent with it, but there's so much more in this than there is in Temurah, and there's none of the Echad Nashim ve'Echad Nashim in this sugya at all that seem to be the focus of the paraphrase according to Rashi and Temurah. So I don't offhand see it doesn't instinctively. It doesn't seem to me that Rashi is just saying the same thing in both places. But okay, right. This is the mathematical chart of the sugya, right? So there's Havamina Maskana in the tangent in Chulin, there's Havamina Maskana in the overall sugya in Chulin, and there's Havamina Maskana in the sugya in Temurah, and you can now create your chart of mathematical possibilities as to how they relate. Right, and actually, there's another Havamina Maskana Chulin, which it's not really Havamina, but the machlokas about how to read the second Akol Shochtin, which raises the possibility of the subject object distinction, which doesn't seem to appear anywhere earlier in the Sugya and Chulin. So that can also integrate into Temurah, right? So if you're building your big Punnett square, right? So you have two options in the bracketed Sugya and Chulin, two options in the overall Sugya and Chulin, two options at the end of the Sugya and Chulin, and two options in the Sugya and Temurah, and mix and match. Okay, that is section number 1. Okay, now let's go to something possibly a little bit substantively cooler in terms of what might be in the back of Rashi's head. So the Gemara Sanhedrin says, Amar Rav Nachman, Hachashud al harayos kasher leidus. Okay, somebody who is suspected of sexual wrongdoing of whatever kind, and what the kind is not relevant to us, nonetheless remains kasher leidut. Amar Rav Sheshet ani mari arba'in bekisve v'kasher. Ani mari is some kind of phrase like Rashi translates anenu adoni, like wow, that doesn't make any sense. Chayev malkosu. Okay, so this person deserves malkos for being chashul arayos. Afal pish ein sham hasra. Damar malkin lo tov hashmua. Shnemar should have put lo tov hashmua in italics, right? Because it's Eli's children. Right, there it is, right? Shnemar albanai kilo tov hashmua. Sorry, my fault. Okay, right. So Rav Nachman says, how can somebody be kosher? They do it if they are deserve malkos derabanan. Okay, this could or could not be a reflection or connected to the sugya in Yoma about whether whether a psul edus derabanan has implications on the Raisa level in terms of korban shua and things like that. Right? Fine. So Rav Nachman says, how could it be that you can deserve malkos and nonetheless be kosher leidut? Okay, interesting question, right? which has all sorts of implications for Hilchos Edus, and on the surface has nothing whatsoever to do with our sugya. The reason it's in our sugya is because there is another use of animari of Arban Mekiseh V'Kasher, and we have to try and figure out what the second one means, and it might very well be that the first one is evidence for what the second one means. So here's the one that matters directly to us. Tani Rabbi Chia. Toda shenis arba betmurasa. You have a korban toda, and somehow a tmura was created for that korban toda. How is not our issue. Umeisa achas mehen. Okay, but you don't know which one is the original and which one is the tmura. Umeisa achas mehen chavirasa ein la takana. So the surviving animal cannot be sacrificed. Ein la takana means it cannot be sacrificed. What are we supposed to do with it? Nakriv lechem bada. If we're going to bring so the korban toda requires an assortment of korban minchas along with it, lechem toda. Nakriv lechem bada dilma tmurahi. But our assumption right now, which is what the Mishnah in there says, is that the tmura of a toda does not require lechem. And there's no such thing. There's no way to do it. Let's assume because the sukkah is going to go through it. There's no way to create a lachme reshus or whatever. Right? We can't solve it. So our initial thing is, hang on a second. If it's a tmura, then we can't bring lechem. If it's a toda, we have to bring lechem. So what do we do with this animal? It can't be yotze. We can't be yotze as a toda without taking the risk of bringing chulin lazar. So this animal is just going to have to be left to die. Fine, and we can't, but that which has its own problems. So there's a whole series of answers. We're only interested in this one. Yasir Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta kameder of Nachman v'yasi v'kamar v'laisi behema v'lechem. Why don't you bring an animal? Bring an animal with lachme toda, another animal, and say about this other animal. If the surviving animal is the tmura, what I am bringing now is a toda. Toda v'halachma, right? So the animal I'm bringing now is a toda, and it has lechem. And the other one, right? You have to kaima toda, but the surviving one is a toda. This is the lachme toda, and this animal should be the tmura. And now I can bring the second animal, because if it's a tmura, it doesn't need lechem, and if it's a toda, it had lechem. So I have solved the whole problem. To which the response is, Animare are blind bekisvi v'kasher. Now we're not going to whip the animal, so that's obviously not the problem, right? So Rashi says, Hu chayev lilkot arbaim al shehemir. How did these? You're now bringing an animal and saying, okay, if the other animal is the toda, this one should be the tmura. So shouldn't we give you malchus? Keditnan shehemir mumar v'sofek arbaim. That amart yafrish l'chadchil l'shein tmura davar shu aser mischayvim malchus. So the simple reading of this sugya is that Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta permits you to create a suffix tmura in this situation. To which the response is, hang on a sec, how can you permit him to do that when he would deserve malchus? Now obviously he wouldn't deserve malchus because it's a suffix. So there's no actual malchus, right? So it's just it's a rhetorical, flourish. You're asking him to do something usher. How can we say that? Right now, the question is, we're saying, how could it be kosher if it's usher, or you're asking, how could you ask him to do it? Right. So Rashi says, "V'ata mart yafrish l'chatchila l'shein tmura davar shu usher mischayvi malchus." Right, so Rashi understands the question here to be, how can you tell him to do something that's asur? Now that is not the pashut language of the kasher. The pashut language of the kasher is, it shouldn't work. The problem is, hang on a sec, tmura is the example of something which isn't kasher and works anyway. And that's going to be one of the big sugya in the first parak, right? It's called Mil Sudam Rachman Lo Savid, Yavid Mahani or Lo Mahani. So it's perfectly reasonable for Rashi to read the sugya that way, that the response of Rav Nachman is, how can you tell a person to bring a tmura? Okay, now that raises the question, hang on a sec, but that means we have somebody else namely Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta, who thinks that there are circumstances in which not only do you not get malchus, but we tell you lichatchila to create a Temurah. Oh, hakol memirin lasuyemai. Now we have constructed a case of Temurah, which is the Chatchila. So now the question is this...
Why do you think...
Pardon?
Sorry, why do you think that he thinks you don't get Malkut? Maybe he thinks this is the solution and you get Malkut.
No, it's a suffix. You can't get Malkut.
Even the Rabbanan.
You're right. I didn't know the Rabbanan. I would have created the Rabbanan here when Lotov Hashmuah by Karbanos, no such thing. Right? So there's no Malkut here. Right? That's not a response. Now we could be much more elaborate and we could claim, we build the whole thing and say, oh, look, you know what? Temurah is only usher when it has no purpose. When Temurah solves a problem, then it's perfectly fine. We could say, hey, that's probably the simplest way to say it. I don't know, right? This sugya, and if we get to the sugya of Kol Milsa Lovid the Amarachman Lo Savid, right? So this will obviously be something to tie in. But for our purposes, the fun of it is now, now there really is a Havamina. That there is a case of Temurah, and I'm sure once we do that, we can construct lots of other cases just like it, right? In which we can say that creation of a Temurah is creation of a suffix Temurah is a halachically useful device. And one person says that's okay. Right, so then we can say, okay, that's the real thing. We can say that's at least the Havmin other sugya, right? We can tie it in together, and that when we get to Achronim, right, that's going to be that is a modus operandi more of Achronim than Rishonim. To say we've created a halachic possibility in one sugya, let's make that halachic possibility a literary possibility in another sugya. Okay, right. So I just wanted to show you that, and then and we'll see that there's a machloket about how to read this sugya, but Rashi is unambiguous about how to read Arbain Bekisei V'Kasher in this sugya, which is not exactly the way he reads it in the other sugya, but there's no real way to read the two sugyas is exactly parallel. Because in one case, Arbain Bekisei and he's kasher, and the other possibility is Arbain Bekisei and it's kasher. Right, so that's hard. So Rashi does his best to make it parallel. Arbain Bekisei V'Kasher by Eidos means, right, he has a Arbain Bekisei and he's still kasher, or his Eidos is still kasher, right, but really he's still kasher, and you're going to tell him to do it. I think that's a reasonable parallel. Okay.
Also, by the way, just interesting to note, in the Sugya in Sanhedrin, that's Rav Sheshet saying that to Rav Nachman, and then in Menachot, Rav Nachman is saying that back to someone else. So you almost think that Rav Nachman adopted it from Rav Sheshet and then deployed it metaphorically.
Okay, that's cute. That's cute. That's very cute. So you think that? Hang on. So which one do you think is the original?
Sanhedrin seems original, right? Because kasher actually works there, right? Kasher was used in Rav Nachman's statement. So Rav Sheshet responds v'kasher, right? So it's a kasher the Eidos question. The language fits much more closely there, right? And then Rav Nachman sort of applies it in this, like metaphorical way. He's like, "Ooh, that's a cool pitgam. I'm going to use that."
Okay, that's very possible. That's very possible. I like that. I don't know if it's true, but it's very possible. Okay. Then there's one other sugya that quotes our Mishnah. Itmar chasam b'kol. This is the sugya of Lasach Sam Shur B'disha. Itmar chasam b'kol v'nhiga b'kol. Rabbi Yochanan Rechayev, Rish Lakish Amar Pater. Rabbi Yochanan Rechayev Akimas Pia Havemase. Rish Lakish Amar Pater. Kala lo Havemase. Fine, right? We're not interested in the lav shein in the definition of masa right now. Eser Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says to Rish Lakish, how can you say that? Right? How can you say that? How can you say that kala lo Havemase, but you get malchus by memir, and that's right. That the only kol there is the only masa there is kol. So Amarle Hamani Rabbi Yehuda Amar Lav She'ein B'Maseh Lo Ken Alav. Okay, so in order to explain our Mishnah, you have to fit it like Rabbi Yehuda. So it turns out that the line we're going to get to our sugya next, which is that a kol asuye. The claim that our Mishnah is following Rabbi Yehuda, which is going to show up in the next section of our sugya, that is the position of Rish Lakish is against Rabbi Yochanan. And then you have to go plug that back into the sugya above. we talked about whether it's there to tell you the claim that Lo Shadam Rashai Lahamir is to tell you that we get Malkos on Lav Shein B'Maseh, so that has to be reading the sugya according to Rish Lakish against Rabbi Yochanan. Right, that's not right. And we're building now. We have a giant, right? Another giant Punnett square every sugya, right? Because it turns out that a literary reading of our Mishnah, right? Well, some of the readings are possible according to Yochanan, some of the readings are Rish Lakish. So you have to read each stage of the sugya to Chulin, and also Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish, who do not get mentioned in Chulin. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Umi matzis ukmas laki Rabbi Yehuda." Can you really Can you really connect this Mishnah to Rabbi Yehuda? But the Reisha Mishnah says, "Hakol memir and echad anashim ve'echad anashim." This is going to be parallel to the next line of our sugya, but not our issue. Right? How can you make our Mishnah, the Mishnah in Temurah, and follow Rabbi Yehuda? The Katani Reisha de Masis and Hakol memir and echad anashim ve'echad anashim umefarish ve'azil dehai Hakol memirin lo shadam rashai lahamir ela sheyesh pen koach litmos b'Temurah b'di eved v'sofek et arba'im mishum lo yachlifenu. So first of all, right, for those who are keeping track, so we have the Rashi in Temurah, which says twice that both the Isra and the Malkus are Lo Yamir. You have the Rashi in Chulin, which says that the Isra is Lo Yachlifenu and the Malkus is Lo Yamir. And now we have the Rashi in Bava Metzia, which says the Malkus is Mishum Lo Yachlifenu. Right, so do with that what you may. There doesn't seem to be a really good way to tie it all. But aside of that, Rashi says over here that the pshat in the Mishnah is Hakol Memirin is explained by saying Lo Shadam Rashai Lemir Ela Sheyesh Ben Koach Litfos B'Temurah B'Diavad. Right. So here we have a clear explanation, and when he's right, and the Gemara already said Havinan B'Hakol Su'emai. So Rashi reads the sugya in Bava Metzia as quoting the sugya in Temurah. Right, this is all a nested quote. Vakatani, the Avinanba. Okay, right. So Avinanba means they're recording a sugya from somewhere else. This Avinanba, Akol Seimai, is the next line of our sugya in Temurah, which means that this section here is Rashi paraphrasing our sugya in Temurah in the Maskana. Right. So Rashi says the Maskana of our sugya is Umefarish v'azil dehai Hakol memirin. Lo shadam rashai lemir, ela sheyesh ben koach litfos b'Temurah b'diavad, v'sovek d'arayim mishum lo yachlifenu. Right, so that sounds like Rashi just says that it's just the chatchila b'diavad, and that's all. Everything, all the diukim at echad nashim don't apply at all. Okay, that seems like a fair read. And this sugya again here, I think it's clear Rashi structurally is just quoting the sugya in Temurah. So that doesn't explain, that doesn't explain all the things that Rashi did there, but it diminishes the possibility of importing all sorts of exciting things in, unless you can find a way to make the exciting things be somehow tangential to it. So what I'm, obviously opening the possibility is that that somehow like we're going to read two purposes to that line. Right, really, there are three things in that line. There's Lo Shadam Rashai Lamir, there's El Shemimir Mumar, and there's Vesovek Darbaim, and maybe each of those has an independent purpose. But Rashi doesn't say any of that explicitly, so it's hard to claim that that's so. Okay, that is the end of the primary evidence I have trying to put Rashi together. But I don't, right, and I don't have an outcome yet. We have 3 minutes left. Let's just introduce what Tosfos is going to start doing to us, and then because I'll say at this point, I don't even know what I don't understand, as opposed to most of the Rashis I knew I don't understand. So by all means, go ahead and be ready to explain how many positions are in Tosfos. What Rabbi Tom specifically held, right? That's what the focus of next week will be, and I hope we'll also get to the Beis Medrash Shel Ramban. So here's what the Tosfos Mechulin says. Hasan Kikatani Tama. So remember, right now we're in the middle of the tangent, right, where the Gemara says, "Really, are all hakols lechatchila? What about Temurah?" And the answer is no. Temurah is unusual because Temurah is Kikatani Tama. So Tosfos begins by saying, "Hasam Kidakatani Tama, Perish Akuntras, the Akar Leila Hakol Deresha, the low tema lechatchilahu. Okay, so Rashi's Katani Tama means that it undoes the Hakol, and the whole sugya is right, means to be evident not lechatchila, which is also consistent with what Rashi says in Bav Mitzvah. Okay, let's go back and make sure Rashi actually said that. Right, so Rashi, right, sorry, back in Chulin. So Rashi said, right, it's a quote. Right, the akar lakol derisha, the lo tema lechatchilu. It leaves out all the exciting stuff Rashi puts in afterwards about Torah. Right, the lishna, but okay, there's nothing inconsistent about it. It also leaves out Vereshachi Kamar called Din Tamurah. That may matter, but that may not matter. But this is a genuine quote. Akar lakol deresha, the lo tema lechatchilu. Okay, so what does Tosfos say about that? So Tosfos says, that back to Tosfos. Tosfos says, "Uvelashon kidekatani tama lo mashba kipirusha." I don't think that's what katani tama means. Katani tama provides a rationale; it doesn't just uproot the meaning. Okay, but that tells us he thinks Rashi read Kikatani Tama that way. And then he says, Umashi Pirish Nami Maskana, Gabe de Idievet Tarti Evid Lamali, and the Rashi's explanation of the final line of the final line, not the bracketed part of Rashi's actually answer, that answer is also wrong. Ein nira, that answer is also not true. The Mishum Vesofik Tarbaim Luchude, Lohavle Lemisni Tarti Dieved, Dave Matsi Lemisni Hakol Memirim Hamemir Sofig et Arbaim. Right? I don't understand. Right? This language is so long-winded. Why do you have to do that? And you can even do it while preserving the language of a kol memirin, just like a kol shochatin. Okay, that also doesn't change our understanding of Rashi necessarily. He just thinks that Rashi is uncompelling. And we'll just finish this dramatic review. Umeshani Hasam Rabbi Yehuda, right, says, "Oh, Bereish Tmurah Parech HaKol Memirin L'Chachila V'Lo Dam Rashai Lamir Diavad." Umeshani Hasam Rabbi Yehuda, Hachi Katani HaKol Matfisim B'Tmurah, Echad Shogeg V'Echad Mezid. What? No Gersa like that anywhere. Nothing in Rashi said anything of the sort. Okay, now Tosfos says, hang on a sec. If Rashi were right, the Gemara should have just given the same answer as it gave here. But for just dramatic reveal, the other sugya, is it really such a girsa? Or is it really such an explanation, even if there isn't such a girsa? And if so, right, does Rashi have it? Okay, that is the end of this week's shir. Thank you again. If anything exciting changes tomorrow, you can listen. I'll probably post the Wednesday night version instead of the Tuesday day version. And I will look forward to seeing you all next week. Are there any questions before we finish? Okay, so next week, really, I would love it if you come in and tell me. Right? I set up the problems, but next week, where the problems aren't in Rashi, the problems of other texts. So I'm happy to have other people explain the other texts to me, that we can figure out together how it goes back to Rashi. All right, thank you. Have a great week.
Yeah, Shikov.